Hi, I'm Radical Liberation in St. Louis, Missouri. You might have heard of St. Louis in the news lately for various reasons, but we'll get to that later. And I have Mad Mercenary from the relatively calm Australia. Is that correct, Mad Mer?
Relatively calm, but we still have a few protests.
Oh, okay. A little bit going on there. Okay, so I'm going to do my usual instinctual thing of making a connection that jumped out to me that may not be obvious at first. But stay with me. I think this is going to pay off. Okay, so first of all, this term anarcho-tyranny, I want to be clear. I'm putting a link that frustratingly points to another article that's sort of supposed to be the real home of defining that term, and I can't remember if I ever did track that article down. If anyone finds it, send it to me, please. Anyway, it's a term from Samuel Francis, and here's how he defines it in the article I just shared in the YouTube chat. This is precisely the bizarre system of misrule I have elsewhere described as anarcho-tyranny. We refuse to control real criminals, that's the anarchy, so we control the innocent, that's the tyranny. So let's talk today about anarcho-tyranny. I'm going to start with a little more of the tyranny bit, and then we'll make our way into the anarchy bit. Quick caveat, I am a libertarian anarchist, but I'm grown up enough to recognize that English is complicated and we use words in various ways. Samuel Francis here uses anarcho-tyranny in the sense of anarcho-tyranny in the sense of chaos, and anarchy is used in that way. Of course, when I'm talking about being an anarchist, I'm not advocating chaos, the very opposite. I think an anarchist, a fully anarchist system would be extremely orderly, more orderly than most people can possibly imagine, and would maybe even find shocking in a way. If you've been to private communities, you would have gotten a little taste of it, I think. But anyway, he's using anarcho in the sense of chaos. I could have tried to recoin the word and call it chaos tyranny or something, but anarcho-tyranny is catchy. It's Samuel Francis coined the term. It's making the rounds. I've already seen it on some other YouTube videos around. And so we'll go with it. So I want to go to a previous historical episode that I think is going to shed some light on our near future. By our near future, I mean those places that have been affected by the riots. All right, so let's start with a paper by my friend Robert Higgs. Okay, where is it? There we go. So Robert Higgs, and I dropped the name advisedly because he and I don't drop the name lightly, I should say, because he and I spent many, many hours talking and hanging out at the Mises Institute. He met my father, praised me to my father. You know, we were friends. He published my main paper in this very journal that we're going to be reading an article from. He's a good guy, and I like to acknowledge him because I miss spending time with him. So he wrote a great paper, Regime Uncertainty, Why the Great Depression Lasted So Long and Why Prosperity Resumed After the War. So how do we explain the puzzle that he's trying to explain? Let's jump to this picture here. Well, let's see. Is this the best picture?
That one, or the one below it.
Yeah. Okay. But I'll come back to these, and we'll revisit these in more detail in a bit. But let's just lay out what is he trying to understand in this paper. He is already in a previous paper, maybe not shocking to the people listening to this show, but shocking to most normies. He's already explained that the Depression went on until 1946. It went from 1929 to 1946, the Great Depression in the United States. As we discussed previously, it didn't have to be that way. And Mad Mercenary brought to our attention Joseph Lyons, Prime Minister of Australia, during that same period, Australia also had a downturn, also had a relatively short contraction, right, Mad Mark? A couple years or something, if I remember correctly.
Yes, it was very harsh, but
Yeah.
rather brief.
Right, yeah, harsh but brief, more like the 1921 experience in the United States, for example. But then through excellent policies of Joseph Lyons, tightening the belt of the government, as opposed to everyone else, novel idea, the Australia actually came out of that depression and actually had a pretty good 1930s, is what we learned on a previous episode. If you haven't seen that story, it's one of our best episodes, I think. And if you haven't heard of Joseph Lyons, you should really watch it. But anyway, unlike that experience in Australia, the United States continued to have a tough time during the 1930s. In fact, look at this. Let's remember, so 1929, you see at the beginning of this graph here that 1929 gross private investment, that's the line as opposed to the bar graph. Gross private investment is pretty good before everything goes down, right, with the crash. It collapses. That's kind of what we all knew that, right, with the 1929 crash. But then it starts to creep up. But then what happens here in about 1937? It crashes down again. Then it starts to creep up again. And then it crashes again during the war. Now that, to some degree, has more to do with the war. But what is this, what do we call it? A triple dip here, right? If we just look at gross private investment. The 1929 crash, we know that story. But what's this second dip and what's this third dip? That's part of what Higgs is trying to help us understand and help us see why it is that it's only in 46 that we really start to see recovery. Okay, so I don't want to get too bogged down in the academics, so I've highlighted some passages. Here's his argument. Private investment was low from 1935 through 1940 because of pervasive uncertainty among investors about the security of their property rights in their capital and its prospective returns. Okay, so what does that mean? That means if I'm going to invest in a business, I want to believe that I'm going to be able to reap the benefits of investing in that business, right? And not lose them in some fashion. If you don't believe that, you have uncertainty, right? Things are not stable. You feel uncertain. You're not sure whether you should invest. Maybe it'd be a good idea to just sit on your money and not do something risky out there in the marketplace. It's always risky to start a business venture, right? Well, if you feel uncertain, then maybe for people on the margin who are, waffling back and forth, should I start this business? Should I not? They feel uncertainty in the air. And we'll get into the details of that. They go, you know what? I don't think I will. I don't think I will invest that money. I don't think I will start that business or whatever. So that's the basic idea that Higgs is bringing to bear on this period. So so that's the 1935 to 1940 period. Then in 41 through 45, he says private investment is replaced by direct government investment, right? War, building ships and weapons and stuff like that. And so he thinks that the fears, which we're going to get into, of the investors went down in the 40s, early 40s during the war period, World War II period, or during the period that the United States, I should say, was engaged in the war. But that didn't help because the government was spending all the money. And so you couldn't get a revival of private investment spending. So that's in brief that third dip, right? But it's this second dip he particularly is interested in. And then to finish up the quick story through these periods is that in 1945, death of Roosevelt, succession of Truman, and the end of the war, investors were optimistic, sanguine for the first time since 1929, freed from government restraints on private investment for civilian purposes. When he says government restraints, it's not just the fact that government spending, but also that there was price controls and rationing and stuff like that. So they're freed of that, and they start to invest, and you get the post-war boom, which really 1946 is the beginning, but everyone agrees that by 1947 the United States was doing well, and it was the beginning of what Higgs here calls the Great Escape, the Great Depression, right, and then the Great Escape from the Depression. He's arguing it didn't happen. It didn't really begin until 1946. Okay, so note here that we see an inverse correlation during the war. Gross domestic product goes really high. Government spending a lot of money on the war. GDP, unfortunately, includes government spending. It's one of the reasons that Austrians don't like that measure very much, because we don't consider government spending to be productive spending. But anyway, that's why those GDP bars are so high. But then at the same time, you see gross private investment just crater during World War II, going below this period we're interested in 1938, and not quite as low, but getting down in the depths of where it was right after the Panic of 29, you know, in the first couple of years after the Panic of 29. One more picture to look at. Okay, this gets confusing. So government purchases, high bars in the 40s, as you'd expect, right? And then gross private investment. Again, you see it crater in 32, low again in 38, and really low in the war years, right? Okay, so, yeah, sorry, one more thing to say about the private investment. Notice that he says gross private investment. The reason he does that is, I think, because gross private investment does not try to account for just keeping your capital going, like maintaining your factory or whatever. It is just, or I'm sorry, it does account for that, is what I meant to say. It doesn't take out what would be, what is it? Sorry. Capital consumption. Yeah, capital consumption allowance. Okay, so that is really what we're interested in is net private investment ultimately. Net private investment is not only did I keep my current plant going or my current business just, you know, where it was, but I invested in it. I actually grew it. I put more into it than just enough to keep it going. He says investment. 1930 to 1940, 11-year net private investment totaled minus $3 billion. And only in 1941 did it go above 1929. So actually, what we're seeing, because this is gross investment, you're kind of getting the wrong picture here. If you look at net investment, this number is going down below the line. And we call that capital consumption. That is, not only are we not maintaining and growing, we're not even maintaining. We're losing our capital. We're eating our. Okay, anyway, wanted to call that out. So why could it have remained depressed? The willingness of business people requires a sufficiently healthy state of business confidence. And the second New Deal ravaged the requisite confidence. Now, the second New Deal, I believe if I understand that correctly, the first New Deal was actually under Herbert Hoover. Rothbard helped us remember that. It had kind of been gone down the memory hole till Rothbard wrote Depression and really brought that to light. And now it's understood in the literature, but probably not well understood among regular folks, that Herbert Hoover had already started to do the kinds of policies FDR did. But then FDR went even bigger with the second New Deal. Anyway, so the second New Deal ravaged business confidence. Business people may be uncertain about the regime, but distressed that investors' private property rights and their capital and the income it yields will be attenuated further by government action. Attenuated is a polite word there, stolen. And so then he gets into this idea that it's not just about looking at what's on the books, it's about whether the laws are enforced. Hopefully at this point, astute listeners are starting to tune in to current events a little bit. So it's not so much about what is on the books, what is legally de jure legal and illegal. It starts to become about what is de facto happening, what's really happening in reality. And what these passages I've highlighted here are pointing out is that that can have a lot to do with the regime. Part of the reason, for example, that US presidential elections are so contested, despite being a federalist system, is that the executive executes the laws of the legislature in the United States. If the executive wants to put a little more emphasis on some laws and a little less emphasis on other laws, we find that that in fact happens, right? So who the president is, who's in executive branch of the government, does actually affect the de facto situation, even if nothing is changed on the books. And of course, as we'll see, a lot changed on the books. So security, to quote Higgs here, security of private property rights rests not so much on the letter of law as on the character of the government that enforces or threatens presumptive rights. And then quoting Andrei Raposinski, this politically determined thin line may be understood as the real definition of rights conferred by the state, as just somewhat fictitious legal notion of property rights, right? So de facto and de jure, remember that distinction. And then quoting from Douglas North and others, in an economy where entrepreneurship is decentralized, economic actors will hold back on long-term investments unless the state makes credible commitments to honor its contracts and respect individual ownership rights. Okay, so what happened? What is this uncertainty he's talking about? Even for based, red-pilled Austrian types, you may not know this history. I learned a lot reading this paper, and we're not going to go into all the details, but I want to give you a little bit to pique your interest. The world was going to central planning in the 1930s, you might recall, in that era. Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, right? You have to be careful not to be anachronistic. That's what Higgs argues here. Anachronistically look back and go, well, we know that the New Dealers did not become as bad as Stalin or Mussolini or Hitler. Actually, they might have been as bad as Mussolini. But anyway, not as bad as Stalin or Hitler, at least. We know that, so therefore they knew that, but they didn't. The people at the time saw advanced economies like Germany, very much a peer to the United States in many ways at the time, going into a fascist economic system where the government was effectively controlling the economy, right? As we learned from the vampire economy, which I can recommend to you, even though it's by Kami. So business leaders at the time sincerely believed that the government was in evil hands and preparing the way for socialism, communism, or some other variety of anti-Americanism. The possibility that the US might undergo an extreme regime shift seemed to many investors in the late 30s and early 40s not only possible, but likely. Okay, now the subjective emphasis of Austrians is so important. Forget about what actually happened. We're trying to understand the decisions that investors made. So we need to get into their mind, how they saw things, right? The fact that they might have been mistaken, they feared that communism would take over and it didn't, is irrelevant. If they thought it would take over, it affected their actions. That's what's significant, right?
Right, and we see this in Europe as well. So in the vampire economy, there's a great quote where the author, I forget his name, the commie, he states that German business leaders hate the parasitic relationship that the bureaucrats have with them. And even though they hate these bureaucrats, they're reliant more and more on them. And that many of these business leaders have started to read communist and fascist books to try and understand what might be happening in the future and prepare for it.
Right, and I shared the link. Thank you for giving me a breathing room to share the link to Gunther Riemanns. I think that's the name. I'm not very good at German. Gunther Riemann, something like that. The Vampire Economy. I shared the link at the Mises Institute, which has a free copy, and it is enlightening. Okay,
He
so
does a very poor job of understanding National Socialism, but he accurately gets firsthand accounts of the business climate of Germany and
right,
Italy at the time.
right, what it was like to actually run a business under the National
Yes.
Socialist regime. I didn't know he covered fascism. He covers Italian fascism as well.
Bits and parts of it, but he does a
Okay,
very poor job of defining the two.
yeah, but his focus is Germany, right? The business
Yes,
and
his focus was
situation of
Germany.
Germany. Yeah, right. So the reality of what Gunter Riemann, whatever, describes in Vampire Economy, that reality that was happening just across the ocean in a very advanced, Germany was renowned at the time for its science, its advanced culture, et cetera, et cetera. So it wasn't like, hey, look what's happened at Zimbabwe. That's never going to happen here. You saw it happen in Germany. You're like, yeah, it could happen here, and so the reality of what Gunter Riemann describes the vampire economy is what many American businessmen fear the beginning of. The policies, the new laws being put in place, as we'll see in a moment, and just the general attitude towards business. Right? It's like if the things we're hearing from FDR get put into practice, we're screwed. Is essentially what they were thinking. Okay. Let's see. The relations of business and government during the latter half of the 1930s were infected with such hatreds and distrusts that the risks and uncertainties of investment decision were seriously increased. First thing to understand is that I talked about de facto versus de jure. There were de jure changes made, significant ones. We'll see in a moment. During the next two presidential terms, so this is after his first term, so his second and third, I think. I'm sorry. No, yeah, his second and third, because his first two, sorry. It was Hoover until 32, I think. I'm getting lost. If you get a chance, find out when FDR started being president. I'm getting confused. So during the next two presidential terms, the Roosevelt administration proposed and Congress enacted an unparalleled outpouring of laws that significantly attenuated private property rights. Let's go right to the table. Selected acts of Congress substantially attenuating or threatening private property rights, 1933 to 1940. Get a load of this table. Let's call out some ones that are pain to this day. The Social Security Act takes more money out of my pocket than anything else, by the way, than federal or state taxes at this point. Let's see. I think the Banking Act of 1935. National Housing Act, National Labor Relations Act. We'll get into that in a moment. That's one I want to focus in on that because of current events. Now let's see. The Gold Reserve Act, where he actually stole the gold from everybody. He nationalized all the gold.
If you don't know that, FDR quite literally said the U.S. government will now seize all gold and silver.
Yeah. Was it silver?
He just took it.
I thought it was just gold. But anyway,
I think it was gold and silver. He just took it. No questions asked. Just law enforcement came into your home and took your gold and silver.
I want to keep my gold. Nope. New law. You can't. And on and on. I don't know all these acts and the
Agricultural Adjustment Act is a crap one.
Yeah, that's a rough one.
Food, drugs, and what's the word there? I can't say, it's too small.
Oh, Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. That probably established the FDA, right?
Established the FDA.
I think so. There's another labor one, Fair Labor Standards Act. So there was multiple labor ones.
This brings us to the idea, and Euron Brook, the noted objectivist, he has a great little short video on this where he states very clearly, taxation, while a pain in the ass, isn't the actual killer of business. Regulation is, and which regulation is enforced, because that's what stops new business from coming forward, and it stops private investment, and it restricts current business that already operates, unless they have exemptions from the government, which then becomes cronyism.
Right,
So it's
right.
regulations
It's who
most
you
of the
know.
time. Yeah, it's who you know. Regulation, not taxation, that should be targeted first if you want to become a freer market.
Speaking of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, look what Turnip Merchant says. Agricultural Adjustment Act killed my family's farming during that time. Was it turnip farming, Turnip Merchant? That's what I want to know. But anyway, but yeah, the many such stories. Um, okay, so I'm not going to go through all these acts he does. Let's see, but just to understand the political environment, FDR was getting pressure from the left or from the socialist side, whatever you want to call it, under political pressure from radical challengers such as Huey Long, Francis Townsend, Father Charles Coughlin, and others. FDR had begun to voice heightened hostility to investors as early as 1934. So notice Higgs is focusing on this 1935 to 1940 period. Before 1940, FDR was holding back to some degree, but I'm sorry, before 1935. But as we come up to 1935, he starts to really kick in the anti-business policies. A couple more details from this section. These soak the rich efforts left little doubt that the president and his administration intended to push through Congress everything they could to extract wealth from the high-income earners responsible for making the bulk of the nation's decisions about private investment. So I'm an investor, and I'm seeing that the regime wants to take any money I earn. That might affect me. If incentives matter, that might affect my decisions, mightn't it?
Just a tiny bit. Just a small bit.
In fiscal 1940, with the Depression still lingering, so now we start seeing the results, the federal government collected 57% more total revenue than it had in the prosperous year 1927. Think about that. So 1927, the boom years, that's before the crash in 1929, right? What do they call them? The Roaring Twenties. Height of the Roaring Twenties, 57% more the government takes in 1940, in the midst of year 11 of a depression. That gives you an idea of what's going on at this time. So it's de jure, right? Where's that table? It's de jure, all these laws. It's also de facto. These laws are actually being executed. The taxes are being taken. The regulations are coming down. Let's see. One other detail known to somewhat to Americans as the switch in time that saved 9. FDR threatened to just add more Supreme Court justices so that he could put in his own guys. He didn't do it, but it cowed the Supreme Court, which had been striking down his unconstitutional attacks on property and so forth and business. And so they stopped striking them down. So when that happened, when the Supreme Court was cowed, investors correctly perceived, quoting Higgs here, that the strongest bulwark against the government juggernaut had evaporated, exposing them to whatever legislative and executive incursions the political process might generate. On this labor relation thing, I want to focus. So I've skipped over a lot of what happened legislatively, but I want to focus on this because this is where it starts to feel a little more like what's going on right now. So labor and unions started to get a lot more favor from the regime, be favored in law and also in terms of enforcement, right? So sit-down strikes started. Unions started to grow as with the National Labor Relations Act and so forth. And they started to get more bold and they started to do sit-down strikes. That means they weren't marching around the property of their employer. They would occupy the facilities and they wouldn't work and they wouldn't leave until their demands were met. President Roosevelt declined to use force to eject the sit-down strikers. Likewise, many state and local officials would not enforce the law against this willful trespassing on private property. So Lichtenberg says, property-minded citizens were scared by the seizure of factories, incensed when strikers interfered with the mails, vexed by the intimidation of non-unionists, and alarmed by flying squadrons of workers who marched or threatened to march from city to city. Is the relevance of this article starting to come in at all here? Notice that the union mob is being backed up by the regime, right? Go ahead.
Right. This is And this is why it becomes very, very dangerous when uh, labor policy includes the right for workers to have unions, because you implicitly have the force of the state backing whatever demand the unions make. So we saw this in the United Kingdom, and we saw this in America during the 60s and 70s, when the unions would make pretty outrageous demands, 30% wage increases, or
Right.
intimidation of non-union workers, destruction of property, and they would get away with it, almost like another group that's getting away with it today.
Right. And academic agent, if you're interested in that, and it's a great parallel, I think, as we're seeing here, if you're interested in the UK situation, which I don't know very much about, not only is academic agent a good economist, but he happens to have on one side be descended from Welsh miners. So he made a video on how the miners, through their union activity, destroyed coal mining in the UK. Coal mining essentially doesn't happen in the UK anymore, as I understand it. They got their wages risen so high with all their striking and the backing of the laws and the regimes that they just destroyed the whole business. It's fun to note that he got a little bit of static from his own mother. That's his Welsh side. His mother about that video. She wasn't totally thrilled, but he stood by his analysis.
Right, and it speaks. Unions aren't always bad if they're just
Right.
a voluntary association acting for the rights of workers. As soon as
Exactly.
they have the force of law behind them, the force of government, that's when they become very, very dangerous, and they
Yep.
can completely kill industries.
Yeah, just as if when I'm sure there's cases like this, just as when employers have like a license to, I don't know, abuse their workers or something legally, then you've got a bad situation, right? If the government allows one side or the other to violate property rights, then you're going to have trouble. Okay, so wanted to focus on that, home in on that labor thing, but then let's zoom back out and wrap up this paper. So here's what one of America's leading investors, Lamont DuPont, you might have heard of the DuPont company, big in chemicals, I believe, 1937, right? Rules the tax situation, the labor situation, the monetary situation. We didn't even get into that. And practically every legal condition under which industry must operate. Are taxes to go higher, lower, or stay where they are? We don't know. Is labor to be union or non-union? Are we to have inflation or deflation? More government spending or less? Are new restrictions to be placed on capital? New limits on profits? It is impossible to even guess at the answers. I wanted to read that quote at length because I think DuPont, I mean, he's a towering figure to this day, the DuPont family. Because that quote, I think, brings home what the world looked like for an investor right in the middle of this period. Okay, then I'm not going to go into it with great depth. Academic agent, for good reason, doesn't like the poll data. But as Higgs points out, we're trying to understand what's in their minds, and the polls give us some sense of it. So listen to this. What do you guys think we're going to have? Let's see. What'll it be like after United States after the war? First choice, system of free enterprise, very much like it used to be, 7%. And this is asking this of investors, I think. An economic system in which government will take over many public services formerly under private management, but still leave opportunities for private enterprise. So I guess that would be, I don't know, like the welfare state or something, or the mixed economy, 50%.
Right, the mixed economy that the communists had the guise and the cover to call it capitalism, but we all understand that it's
right.
It's not exactly a free system.
Right, and the whole point, of course, in contrast to one, is that we're not going back. 50% are saying we're not going back to how it used to be. It's going to be less free enterprise, right? But let's keep going. Option 3, a semi-socialized society in which there will be very little room for the profit system to operate. Now, that would probably be like the vampire economy, the National Socialist way of running an economy, or the fascist, Italian fascist way. 36.7%. And then even 3.7% of the respondents thought it would be just a complete economic dictatorship along fascist or communist lines. So that gives you a sense. Almost 93% of them expected the post-war regime to be one that would further attenuate private property rights to a greater or lesser degree. More than 40%, at questions 3 and 4, expected a regime in which government would dominate the economy. Not a great way to encourage private investment. Okay, so yeah, he gets into financial markets. Go ahead.
We see this with the post-war era. I think there was the 1962 or 1963, something like that. Learning Liberty has a great video on it about the tax code. And the tax code, the initial tax code is I think it's 10 pages long, and then the exemptions for that tax code are 10,000 pages long. So the business community has learned that, well, the only way we survive in this environment where there's more government regulation is to get the exemption from the law, and to increase our influence with politicians and bureaucrats and try and influence the outcome of future laws so that we don't get hit and our competition does. And that's the beginning of cronyism.
Yes, and it's not a good place to be. Okay, last few things to wrap up this paper. Usually we'd be spending more time on the bond markets and stuff like that on this show, but just very briefly, he has a section on evidence from financial markets, and he shows some bond yield data and summarizes it. I'll keep the graph that he's talking about here. The bond yield data displayed in this figure here tells a dramatic story. Investors' confidence in their ability to appropriate the longer-term interest payments and principal repayments promised by the country's most secure corporations plummeted between early 1934 and early 1936. That's that spike up, because you have to read it upside down, right? Yeah, anyway. So yeah, that's what happened there. Okay, and that's pretty much what I want to get out of the paper. So let's go to current events with that as a backdrop. And I'm going to try to introduce a new word. My friend Robert Higgs introduced the term regime uncertainty. I don't know if this is a term that's existed, but I'm going to try introducing a new term today called mob uncertainty. You could be dismissive.
A mob.
Yeah, right. But by saying mob
really
uncertainty,
what the mob is going to do.
Right, but I'm talking about something. Everyone. I'm talking about something very specific with mob uncertainty. And we got to tease out what mob uncertainty right now really means, right? Okay, but first, let's just address right away one of the things we've already been hearing, which is, well, they can just rebuild, they can just use insurance, blah blah blah. It's what why are you whining, right? That's essentially what we hear. So, Mad Mercenary, I think I want to do it in the order you gave it to me, right? Okay.
Oh, you can just bring those. You can bring those pictures up, and I can just summarize them.
Well, I'm going from the PDF here.
Oh, okay.
Okay, why am I not seeing that window? Okay, sorry, I'm getting lost. Application window, cost of security. Try that again. Share. Sorry, I don't know what's going on. Oh, I didn't launch it in the app. That's my problem. Okay, here we go. Sorry. Slight technical glitch. Okay, here we go. So I'll read it, you explain it. Costs of preventive efforts. Crime-related operational costs also accrue in the form of increased investment in loss prevention endeavors and security measures designed to ward against future crime recurrences. In their study of New York small businesses, Gallagher discovered that on average, annual spending on security countermeasures increased by $7,000, so $7,000 a year per victimized business. Even in those instances where a premise has not directly fallen prey to crime, Fear of victimization may prompt the purchase of additional security measures. So the victimized business is itself probably going to spend more on security, and the people around that saw it or heard about it might also spend more on security. Right, Madmer?
Right. It has the crime has a greater effect than just the business that got hit. There are repercussions from it. When that one business gets hit, other businessmen see this as a potential threat and want to try and prevent and take preemptive action to stop any future losses. Therefore, they invest in defensive measures and security measures such as security cameras, firearms, bars on windows,
security guards, right?
security
Security
guards,
services.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yep,
Right.
exactly. And this, if again, as it says, $7,341 per victimized business. So if you imagine and that's just on average. If you imagine a high crime area, how often they will be investing in security, where those resources, those scarce resources of the business, could have been uh, allocated to other needs for the business, such as expansion or hiring on a new employee. It hurts the business. Crime
Right.
hurts businesses. Water is
Yeah.
wet.
I was thinking, right, exactly. I was also thinking of just like the broken window effect, right? That is,
Yes.
just like in Bastiat's broken window story, when crime happens, well, sure, now you see spending on security and security bars. And so the security business is stimulated, right? Yeah, but if the business didn't feel that need to spend on security, maybe they could have hired someone else, grown their business, right? This is in a sense, it's kind of a loss relative to what could have been business growth. Okay, so let's go to another figure here, or a table. Okay, tell us about this table, Madmer. Mad Mercenary, did I lose you? You're muted. Uh-oh. Give me just a sec to communicate with Mad Merc. Okay, some issue, hoping Mad Mercenary can rejoin or something like that. So let's look at this.
Hello.
Oh, there you go. Okay,
Sorry
go ahead,
about that. I dropped my headphones and everything went down.
Okay.
Yes, this table basically again demonstrates types of businesses, the percentage of businesses that have been victimized by crime, and the amount of money, the mean amount of money that they would have spent on the victims would have spent in either repairing or security or that sort of stuff.
Right.
So, and this is both the business directly and indirectly. So indirectly being like businesses around
Okay.
around the other business. So
Mhm.
you see the initial effect and the knock-on effect.
Right. Okay, and then one more. What's this last one? Nope, it's this one.
Again,
Yeah,
water is wet. But we have to prove that water is wet.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's what economics consists of to some degree. Restating the obvious over and over in the face of people for some reason denying it. Okay, tell us about this part.
Can you just increase the size of that so people can read it?
Let's see. That's not working. How about like a little more like that? The highlighted sections, at least. Is that better?
Right. Again, water is wet. Surrounding businesses felt that they had to, as it says here, fortify their premises and spending money on security installation or upgrades. So when crime waves happen, there's a reallocation of resources towards preventing the crime affecting their own business, and this allocation of scarce resources affects that business, or this crime wave prevents businesses from being opened in the first place because they fear that their business will be targeted by the criminals. So there's no point. There's an uncertainty in the market.
And the second point is really striking, right? We all know you go to a nice area, right? A nice shopping area, and there's restaurants, there's places to shop, there's maybe just fountains, places to hang out or whatever. It draws people. It draws what do they call passing trade, right? It draws people who are just in the area for some other reason and decide to try your business because, let's say you have a restaurant, they came to shop, and then they're hungry and they see your restaurant right there and they go, hey, that looks like a great place to eat. I'll give it a try, right? So there's
increased foot traffic.
Right. So there's a cumulative effect. The whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts, right? In an area, a little shopping street or something like that. Here it's describing the reverse of that. Other proprietors don't renew their business lease because they're afraid of attacks. So they close their business. You get a little bit less passing trade, right? And then that means some businesses that were kind of teetering on the edge for other reasons go out of business because they're not getting that foot traffic anymore. And so you start to get, as it says here, a vicious cycle of deterioration. And it becomes hard to come out of that and attract new businesses because we talk about an area going up or going down, right? Well, crime can cause a business area to start to go down, and it hits that, goes into that nosedive, and it can be hard to come back out of it, right?
Right, because these areas that start to lose property rights and lose the rule of law, it's a very basic thing for the market to work, but it's something that everyone needs to remember is that you need property rights, you need the rule of law, you need security, you need stability for people to try new things, to set up a business, to be an entrepreneur. Without the fundamentals, without the foundations, you can't build upon that. It's like building a cathedral. You have to have your foundations hard and set in stone first before you can actually start to make something beautiful. So, to current events, finally, for just a minute, and then we'll go to the chat. So, what is this? What do we want to look for in what's going on now and what happens next? When I said mob uncertainty, I think it's a good phrase. I hope I can meme it out, get it memed out there, get it going. Mob uncertainty then is like the regime uncertainty that FDR created, but instead it's created by the mob. A mob might loot my business like they looted the business down the street or not too far away. And so maybe I just won't renew my lease, or I'll move out of here or whatever. So areas will wither as a result of the rioting and looting and destruction that we've seen. But the thing that mob uncertainty, now with going through this paper and everything, I think you all have the context to understand that mob uncertainty, I think, is worse when you have anarcho-tyranny, right? That is, the mob is not just doing things, but they're doing it with the backing of the regime. Or the regime's support. Yeah, regime's kind of looking the other way. This is, remember I talked about de facto and de jure? De jure, everybody who looted and rioted and destroyed things was breaking laws, right? The laws are on the books, so what's the problem? Well, the problem is that the laws were not. As we saw, for nearly a week, the laws on the books meant nothing. And de facto,
they were getting away with it. Well, people aren't dumb, right? You can say, well, there's a law against looting on the books, and people go, yeah, and my buddy got looted anyway, despite the law, right? So who are you going to believe, the law books or my lying eyes, right? So this is going to affect how people see things, and it's not just the behavior of the mob, it's the behavior of the regime.
Right.
Trump talked big earlier this week about, hey, we're going to put an end to this, right? Well, I bet a lot of investor business type people are watching carefully going, is he going to put an end to it? Is he going to put an end to it hard and to reference a friend of ours, a binary surfer kind of way? Is he going to put this down such that it never happens again? That's what they're going to be watching for, right?
Right. And when we're talking, just to clarify, when we're talking about the regime, we're not talking strictly about the federal government here.
Yes,
we're also
right.
talking about state, we're talking about governors, we're talking about police chiefs. You know, anyone who has a substantial position of authority can impose their will through force upon another person. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about strictly federal.
Right. So we would not expect in the United States in the coming couple of years here, we would not expect that the effect of these riots, the effect of mob uncertainty, is going to come throughout the United States. Some places have been more permissive of rioting, and they are going to be hit harder by decreased investment and so forth. Some places, everybody got out their gun and stood in front of shops, right? And those business owners are going to be like, well, when I was in a pinch, my folks backed me up, you know, my community backed me up, and the police didn't allow this rioting to get started, right? I think that's happened in some places. But however it happens, if it leaves people feeling the confidence that my business was safe and it'll be safe next time something like this happens, they're going to have a very different story economically in the next couple of years than the places where, to name names, Democratic mayors and so forth, right, spend all their time talking about how angry people are, and you got to kind of understand they're angry, so they kind of can't help it but to destroy your business. Sorry, buddy, you're out of luck. You know, places like that are going to be hit very hard.
We can't help how people express their anger over this event.
Yes, exactly. So I can't help but bring up what both Academic Agent and this YouTuber who I've been really enjoying, Intellectual Embargo. I'll share a video of his with you. What both of them have emphasized is a parallel to the 1967 riots in Detroit. Also had a lot of race angles to it. Detroit was doing very well. It was called the Paris of the West up until 1967. And, well, you guys might have heard that Detroit's not doing so well these days. It started in 1967 with those riots. So, any other thoughts on applying this to the current circumstances before we go to the folks here?
Just that if you're gonna say something, you gotta do it, or else people just view you as a paper tiger.
Yep.
If you say you're gonna bring in the National Guard, you better do that, or you look like a paper tiger. If you say you're gonna want a race war, as many of the protesters do, I hope you don't want to do that, but unless you do that, you look like a paper tiger. You have to back up your words with action, or else they don't mean anything, just like the law. Unless that law is backed up with some action from the police, from the judiciary, then it means nothing.
Exactly. And so
it's cheap. Actions need to be paid for.
Right. Business investors are not going to be fooled by Trump happy talk for long, right? Or at all, probably. They're going to see what actually happened on the ground in their place where they are considering investing more in their business, opening a new business, keeping a business. How many business owners are like, you know, I think it's time to retire, right? After all this.
Yep.
Okay, once again. Oh,
Now,
I
you
haven't
don't
lost tweets. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
also, you don't have to have, like, again, it's like running fast. You don't have to be the fastest runner. You just have to run faster than the fat kid. In saying that, you don't have to have the best or the most perfect or a totally anarchist, anarcho-capitalist state in order to have a good business environment. You just have to have something better than rampant violence.
Right. Um, okay, so let's see. It says we must have monarcho-capitalism. That would be better, I think.
No.
Let's see.
I think monarchy has a tendency to devolve into
Democracy.
the tyranny we're trying to avoid.
Okay, let's see. A lot of people talking about notifications, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Um, they're talking about various book recommendations. Read the chat if you want to see. Oh, Turnip Merchant, thank you. 32 was FDR's first election, right? So earlier when he's talking about his first 2 terms, he's talking about 32 through 1940, which makes sense. That was mostly the time we were focused on there. Yeah, somebody was just highlighting this. Republicans ran on overturning Social Security. This is after FDR's death, But when they won, they never did turn it back. So as usual, conservative Inc., or whatever you want to call them, the official right is just...
Right, and this is the problem. I think this is what distinguishes a libertarian from a conservative. If a law has been in power long enough, the conservatives will adopt it and say it's
Yes.
part of the foundation, it's
Right.
integral to society, it's part of the social fabric. A libertarian will see it and say that was added on at X date and is unnecessary and is bad because of XYZ reasons.
Right. And you might recognize it's going to be hard to reverse it, but you would still want to reverse it. You'd still want to try,
Yes.
or you'd still, you might have tactical concerns, but long-term strategy would be to get rid of the darn thing. So this is the difference between, one of the many differences between our friend Academic Agent, who would reverse NHS if he could, and Sargon, who, though he has, I think, great liberal instincts in many ways, classical liberal instincts, he wouldn't stop NHS if he could. As far
No,
as
I think he believes that because it's universal, that's what makes it okay. Which is
yeah, and Hayek argued
interesting
something like that
opinion,
as
let's
well.
say.
Yeah. Turnip Merchant said it was wheat and corn that the AAA law,
Okay.
just wheat and corn farming, that his family got destroyed.
And the Great Depression was the crash and the Great Depression were agricultural depressions. Well, the crash.
Well, what do you mean? It was,
there was a bunch
the
of
initial crash was in the stock
agricultural
market.
equipment. Well, yeah, but there was a bunch of agricultural tomfoolery, shall we say? Tractor quotas for tractors and quotas for corn and barley and all these sorts of agricultural products that was manipulating the market.
This is interesting. Lawrence Thames says South Africa are at this stage with their mines now. So I guess he's saying that they've gotten all to the point where we might expect that the South African mining is going to have trouble being sustainable.
See, I would put down the South African situation to the many of the South African workers are entitled, and it was the same thing with many of the miners in Britain. They were entitled because of the position that they held and the strategic importance that their industry held. They held a lot of sway, and they were entitled, and they got too greedy.
Craig H says, my Welsh family are now red-pilled on unions. That's amazing. Let's see. Robin Watertree says, this recalls the way the PSI, I don't know which party that is, gained a majority of the Italian parliament, then gave themselves the right to strike. I assume that was a Labour Party or something like that. And by right to strike, he probably means not just, of course, you have a right to not go to your job if you don't want to, right? He probably means more than that. He means the legal privilege that Mad Merc was describing. Okay, to the point of current events. Charlemagne. Democrats have shown that they are willing to use a private army to violate property rights. This army must be opposed and defeated, or else it will be good game for property rights. By the way, my children just explained to me what GG means. I didn't know.
Tried explaining it to you, man.
I'm not a gamer guy. Or, well, I haven't been a gamer for 30 years. Let's put it that way. Let's see. Koreans should set up a security business, Lawrence says. Let's see. That's an interesting observation. Lawrence Tim, if you go to a store, it has armed guards and cameras everywhere. That will put some people off. It's an interesting point. I mean, when I see bars go into a neighborhood and there's bars on every window and every door, that's a signal. I mean, it's fair to say. And I am through neighborhoods like that regularly, by the way.
When I was in a certain African country, there were armed guards in front of every single store.
Wow.
Yeah, they had shotguns, they had AKs, they had PKs.
Serious security costs.
Yes, very serious security costs. The weapon safety was very poor. They were using the shotguns as chairs, but it does put some people off. I knew some locals who didn't shop at those places, even if they wanted to have a nice dinner out, because they were afraid that they were going to get profiled by those guards. Now, whether their fears were justifiable or not, that's another question. But, it can be uninviting. On the other hand, you can understand with what they were in a rather poor African country, you can understand why the businesses felt that they had to invest in such security.
Yeah. No, it's entirely rational, right? There's nothing irrational.
Yes. For the area we were in, it was very rational.
Very rational. Lawrence Tim, in some places, I hear he's talking about the, shall we say, spontaneous security many of us saw in videos being provided. In some places, they saw the law wasn't being enforced. So even though they can't legally open carry outside their business, they were doing it anyway. So that's interesting. That goes the other direction, right? I've been emphasizing where the regime is not enforcing laws that one could say are just, right? Property rights. Here's a case where they stopped enforcing unjust laws and allowed people to actually protect themselves, even though it was illegal for them to protect themselves in quite that way. So, yeah, I guess it swings both ways a little bit. Okay, once again, it loses my place. Let's see. Almost there. So Turnip Merchant describes a recent strike that is not too long ago. In the US, we still very much see tyranny by unions backed by law that FDR gave them. Teachers in Oklahoma had a strike a while back. They completely halted the education system and they just sat there. Still got paid, sunk the state budget, and of course the taxpayer wasn't consulted about the wage increase. Public unions need to be outlawed after the stunts that they've pulled, or more preferably, the government needs to get the hell out of these services. Right. So the story of unions in the United States, just to jump forward real quick on that story, is that unions in private businesses are almost gone. It's very, very small. They used to have a lot of clout, and now they're just essentially they're gone. But because of the nature of the government, public unions, so unions for policemen and firemen and teachers and things like this, continue to be strong and have effects like what Turnip Merchant just described. Lundberg says
because they're negotiating with the government, their potential gain is essentially unlimited, and because they're a public sector employee, many of these employees are considered essential: teachers, police, nurses. And so the government, A, doesn't want to fire them, and B, if they do fire them, like like what happened in Australia, Queensland specifically, we fired 20,000 nurses who were literally doing nothing.
Oh, wow.
And let's just say the PR wasn't good on that. And they lost the next election. And politicians are afraid of that.
Yep. Lumberg says we should not rely on the state to suppress this insurrection. People should be empowered to be able to defend their own property. Yeah, so I've had one, I guess, left libertarian or something like that, left libertarian anarchist or something like that, accusing me of being right libertarian. I would say this
Even
on Twitter.
in the libertarian camp.
On Twitter,
Sorry,
I would say
the idea that being right wing is an insult. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, well, there's that. But he specifically was saying you're making an error. He felt that I was standing for the state police, and I don't. I have made some tweets in recent days that tried to put some things in context, like all the deaths that have now been caused by the riot. Last number I saw from Paul Joseph Watson was 17 deaths from the riot.
Yeah, I would try to get that independently sourced because I don't trust him. But
yeah. Well, my number was 11, I think, that I had come up with, where I saw individual stories proving each one. But anyway, 11, 17, something like that, and I compared that to the number of unarmed Black people that were killed by police last year, in all of last year, which was 10. So I pointed out that the riots have now resulted in more deaths than all of the unarmed Black people who were killed by police, which presumably the riots are protesting against. And of course, the riots have been going for a week, and they've already passed up that number. So he saw this as minimizing police violence and stuff like that. That was not my point. My point was to maximize the destructiveness of the riots, including people literally being killed. But having said that, I do think it's worth noting that I don't think government provision of police is the way to go. I am an anarchist, and I would strongly recommend to you, I hope I can pull it up quickly, I'd strongly recommend to you an episode of The Tom Woods Show, which will blow your mind and open your eyes. It's about the Detroit Threat Center, and this fellow who has this business, he runs the Detroit Threat Center. He provides security, private security, to neighborhoods and businesses and so forth. And they have cut down on violent crime and made a point of defusing dangerous situations without violence. So the choice that's offered to us, as usual, is fall off the horse on one side or fall off on the horse on the other. Either you have out of control mob violence or the police are cracking heads. But as an anarchist, I believe there's a path right down the center. We don't have to have mob violence, but we also don't need to have bad security provision either, provided by the monopoly state. Okay.
Who would have guessed it? A state-run institution doesn't do its job very well.
Exactly.
Never heard that story before.
So let me be clear. Let me be clear. I'm not entirely, my comments are about the riots. I'm not entirely out of sympathy with those who are protesting police violence. I think they're factually incorrect it turns out that police are picking on, killing Blacks more than whites or something like that. If you look at the stats, you adjust for how much violent crime is done by Black Americans, you find that in fact there more whites than Blacks are being killed than you'd expect, really. So I think the racial angle is just completely a boondoggle. But if they're protesting police violence, to some degree I'm on board, right? But I don't like the riots. Yeah, Lauren says you will look after your own property better than the state and defend it better. Okay, pseudonym, our favorite. Will things move even more to a delivery service model? Why have a shop that can be looted when you can keep it safe and a warehouse out of town? Yeah, that's interesting. Just going back to the before time, coronavirus thing with the lockdown and all that, which we've almost forgotten about, and everybody's obviously totally ignoring with the protests and the riots. We already saw that people have been having to figure out how to do things remotely. My job has purely been remotely for months now. And we've all been figuring out how to work this way. And I hear my coworkers saying, it's going to be a little hard to go back because now that I've set myself up with like a home office and gotten the kinks worked out, it's actually a pretty good way to work, you know? So between that, people learning how to do things virtually who can, some people's jobs obviously can't, and looting and rioting and destruction of small businesses will, you know, I mean, Amazon and Walmart and everybody were already destroying small retail shops and stuff like that. Well, I don't think this rioting and looting is going to help them come back. I think it's going to accelerate the destruction of many small businesses.
Right, and let's view it from we on this show we usually do take the side of the not of the protests or the government, but of the entrepreneur and the businessman.
Right.
But again, let's just take it from the businessman's perspective. You've had a decrease in revenue for, let's say, the past month and a half.
Because of the lockdown.
Because of
right.
Coronavirus and the lockdown. So you've had decreased foot traffic, you've had decreased sales, you're having to lay off staff, perhaps. Yep. And now your business just gets burnt to the ground, or you're in now you're in a high crime area because it's permissible for the rioters to vandalize and loot, and the police are doing nothing about it. How many of these businesses are going to survive in these inner city areas? I would say very few. Then you get an increase in bad neighborhoods, you get an increase in unemployment, it's just huge knock-on effects by one crisis after another. And if we have a second wave, which some people are speculating, some people aren't,
we'll see.
I don't know about the infectiousness or the lethality of coronavirus. I'm not a doctor, but if there is a second wave, then that would be a reinstitution of the lockdown. That would be another crisis that these businesses would have to go through. You can't operate like that. You
triple blow. Triple blow.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get through a little more.
It's like us here. A lot of farms and a lot of businesses are just going under now because we had the fires, then we've had coronavirus, now we're in a recession. And it was announced yesterday or 2 days ago that Australia is officially in a recession. First one in 30 years.
Wow. Sorry to hear it.
So,
Robin Watertree, PSI, referenced earlier, was the Italian Socialist Party in 1919, which started the 2 red years. Very interesting bit of history that has been totally flushed down the Orwellian memory hole. Great paper by Ralph Raico explaining why Mises said something sympathetic about the Italian fascists. Doesn't make any sense why he was sympathetic to them very early, unless you understand about PSI, the red years and all that. Anyway, PSI allowed unions to create labor monopolies and to take violent action. So just as Mad Mercenary was saying, we're not talking about just a little club of employees that supports each other or something. They had the backing of the state. Say again.
Private unions are fine. Theoretically, private unions are fine. It's when they have the force of the state backing them is when it becomes a problem. Because that's a violation of property rights.
Lawrence Tim says in Egypt they have guards outside all the hotels because they don't want terrorists to come in like North African countries. Ali says we have a saying in Persian. They bound the stones and let the dogs free. I don't fully understand, but I get the general gist. It's a way of saying anarcho-tyranny. Right. Let's see. Yeah, Darren J. This is the thread I shared. Darren J. Beatty has a Twitter thread listing every death caused by the riots, and he's continued to add to it. So that would probably document that number that PJ came up with. It must have grown since I grabbed the number yesterday. It's horrible. Charlemagne says Tom Woods is cool and good. Yep, he's an old friend. AA should get Tom Woods on the cigar stream. That'd be interesting. Let's see.
Smoke a cigar. That's the other thing.
There's a good meme of Jeff Bezos from Amazon thanking for crushing high street business for him. Right. Yeah. Speaking to this whole issue of, great times for Amazon are coming, right? Because I'm not going to go down to that area that just had riots, right? I'm gonna see if I can order it online.
I think Amazon stock is on the rise again pretty quickly. So if you want to invest.
Lawrence Tim says Corona 2, Boogaloo. Yeah. And then Lumberg says, likewise, the rise of UK union power directly after the Great War is largely forgotten and was very influential. Yeah, there's so much history we don't know. So that's the end of the chats. I'm ready to wrap it up. Any final comments? Stay safe, everybody.
Stay safe, don't do anything stupid, and try and advocate for liberty and freedom. And don't just say, burn it all. Fight for something. Don't run away.
Yeah. We want to build somehow in the midst of all this. We want to build, not destroy, or at least look towards building in the long term. Start getting ourselves prepared to build something very positive when the failure of the regime of our current system becomes manifest. I don't think you should wait. I'm with some of the Agora types in that regards. I think we should be building things, exploiting every crack, every loophole, and building things that will come to full bloom as we have a better environment. We shouldn't wait for the state to move, and we shouldn't wait. If we're going to wait for the CNN types, right, the ruling elites, to learn economics and become red-pilled and become Austrian and stuff, we're going to wait a really long time, forever. So we can't count on that. We just have to hope that somehow they're out of our way and the things that we build can fully take over as the institutions that are failing fall apart. So yeah, I agree. Keep it positive.
I think this is the note we leave it on. There is always opportunity in crisis.
That's the point, Mad Merc. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.